when you say, the Lord be with you, and the response is, and with your spirit. Why do we say, and with your spirit, and instead of with his spirit? Okay. So, the response that we use is actually, and with thy spirit. And there is an important grammatical or lexical, lexical means the meaning of words, right? Lexical distinction between thy and your. And that is that thy is singular, whereas your is plural. So you're actually, when I say the Lord be with you, I mean all of you. And when you say, and with thy spirit, you mean you're talking to me. Because I'm the one who just addressed you. So basically it's just an exchange of the Lord be with you and with you. So in modern English, right, and even if we were going to keep the and with your spirit, like some people have, like the new Roman Rite is like this, rather than and also with you, they have and with your spirit. And the new Anglican Church North America Rite is like that too. They've done it all in modern English, but it's still keeping the cadence. So all that's doing is changing from the thy singular to the your singular, right? We don't use thee and thou and thy anymore in normal English. We use you for the singular now. But if you're using thee and thou, then those are singular and you is plural.
How does it change when it's just you and me talking, not you saying to all of you, it's just you saying it to me?
Right, so it's contextually based, right? In the service, when we're doing Rite 1, we all understand, or we hopefully understand, that because thee and thou is an option, right, then you is necessarily plural, right? But if you and I are just talking over coffee, like we don't use thee anymore, right? And we understand that amongst ourselves, and so we don't assume that you is plural, right? So, what's that? You're confused? Do you know in what way you're confused?
Supposing we had rolled back the clock and we were talking about that.
Yes.
Would we say, the Lord be with thee?
If we meant it to be singular.
Yes.
That's kind of
And
the question
familiar.
that I was asking.
Right.
You're
So-
having coffee back hundreds of years ago.
Okay.
You would say
Then
that would be different from.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if we're sitting around in 1400, 1450, say, we've probably reached early modern English by then, maybe. And so if we're sitting around then we're talking familiarly, right? Then we would use thee. Right?
Okay, but because we've lost...
Canst thou pass the salt, right? I mean, that would have been normal. Yes?
So because we're using, because we've dropped the thee and thou, you has taken a singular or plural connotation.
Right.
So if we're talking in modern English, it's contextual whether or not we mean one you or multiple you. Or
Correct.
one your or multiple.
Right, so you just don't know unless you understand the context,
What we
right?
usually do.
In modern English, we assume that it could be either singular or plural, and you just get it from context, right?
But if we are speaking in older English, then you is never singular.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, okay. it's never singular and familiar. Okay? So if you're addressing Queen Elizabeth I, you say, Your Majesty, because she's the Queen, and you don't use the familiar singular with her.
Okay.
Right? So it's exactly the same rules, essentially, as like Spanish tu, right? Which is the singular familiar. But you don't say that if you're being respectful, right? It's not necessarily that you're being disrespectful if you use it, you're just being familiar, right? So if, you're speaking to Don Fernando, you say, you don't use, and you're not in Spain, right, where they use vosotros. If you're speaking, well, that's still familiar, but it's plural, right? So if you're speaking to Don Fernando and Don Francisco, right, you don't use vosotros because that's familiar. You use no. You use
That's familiar too.
Ustedes, right? If you're talking to just Don Fernando, then you don't go back to the singular tu, which comes even through into Latin American Spanish. You use usted, which is formal.
So when we're addressing God in the liturgy, we use you.
No, and that's the funny part, okay? This is a great question. We actually address God in the familiar.
Because he is our Father.
Because we are allowed, right? He's familiar. We're children of God, right? And so, so that's what people don't understand about the these and nows in Rite 1. There actually is a theological significance to those, right? I'm not going to die on that hill. I mean, there are other reasons why I don't want to use Rite 2, right? But I would use the new ACNA, modern English Rite, and get rid of the these and thous if that were called for. But there is a significance to them that most people don't even hear anymore because they don't understand that distinction. That we're actually addressing God in the familiar form.
I like that.
Yeah.
So if the correct response is with thy spirit, but we're not in the 1400s, why is that the correct response now?
Right. Well, and with your spirit would be okay. I don't mind that. But since we're using the familiar second person singular, then we want to use it correctly, right? And
it's a grammatical concern, not a theological one.
Yeah, I mean there are theological significances to the use of the second person familiar singular, right? But yes, I mean they are because of the grammatical differences, not the other way around, right? So the other reason is, and this is something that people don't understand about the earliest American or Anglican liturgies, is that by the middle of the 16th century, those distinctions were starting to break down already. They were already starting, not always, but starting to sometimes use you as the singular familiar second person. Okay? So by the time the it's okay. By the time the authorized version comes around, the King James translation, right? They made a conscious decision to use slightly archaic language in their translation.
Why?
Okay, so the reason they did that is because that gave it a sense of tradition, right? the point of doing that was to say implicitly, right, we're not just making this up, right? It's not ours. We have received this, right, from of old. Which is, an important point, I think, these days in particular, to keep. Whether that means you keep these and nows or not is another question, right? But a lot of people in the 70s, 80s, 90s were, and some people even today are pushing for, this doesn't mean anything to anybody anymore, use language that people understand. But what they don't understand is that there was always a tension between using language that people will understand readily and using it the way we've received it, right? So even by the time of the first prayer books, right, there's a decision to be made there, and it's maybe a little easier for Archbishop Cranmer to make that in 1549 than it is for the translators to make it in 1611, right? That's 60 years is kind of a long time, right? Insofar as the progression of a society, right? So that's the other thing, is that we don't, when thinking of our own time, we think of the 60s as long ago. But when thinking of history, right, we often compress it and think, well, that was only 80 years. What's the big deal, right? Well, that's a lifetime, right? That's a big deal, right? So we have to kind of remember those things, but there's always been that choice of, do we use older language to make everybody remember that this is received and not merely invented, right?
It's a thin line, because the
It is.
language can be a barrier to God if
Absolutely.
you don't understand what you're reading.
That's right. So when I was in seminary, I took a Greek readings class. It was kind of like a 1 credit per year or per semester, and you just took it for several years just to keep your head in the Greek game, right? You keep reading the New Testament with other people in Greek. At one point in that class, we decided to do committee translation. We decided, this is what we'll do for the next however many weeks, is we'll take the last chapter of 2 Peter, right, and we'll just translate it as a committee, like as if we were, the translators of the RSV or the ESV, right? And what came out of that was really, really interesting, right? Because I went to a seminary where we didn't have a lot of basic theological differences, right? I mean, we all agreed on the theology, mostly. There were some differences, high church, low church kind of stuff, but there, not like, well, what does this Bible verse mean? Not a lot of that. But what happened as we tried to agree on a translation, right, was that we found this tension between those people like me who wanted to make the translation as precise as possible and then teach, right, I'll just leave it at that. I wanted to make it as precise as possible and then teach anything that was not understood, right? And the other end of the spectrum was people who went, no one's going to understand that English, right? Let's do it this way, the way they'll understand it, even though it's not quite as good a translation.
When you say
Right?
good and...
I'm putting that in scare quotes
precise,
for those of you listening at home.
Yes.
I did the dreaded air quotes.
When you say precise and good, are you meaning literal?
I mean,
slightly-
not so much literal as precise.
Talk about participles.
What about participles?
the whole question of whether we translate them as literally as possible, or whether we put a clause around them.
Right.
So
yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So, translating Greek, actually, we just read part of this morning, right? The first chapter of Ephesians, right? And Father John leans over to me and says, that must be the longest sentence in the Bible. Because everything we read today was actually part of one sentence. Wow. Part of it. We didn't even read a whole sentence. Okay? And that was a fairly longish reading, right? No. Well, it's like almost the whole first chapter of Ephesians is one sentence. The reason it can be that way, right? In English, you really can't do that without losing the thread somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. But the reason it can be that way is because you just string participles together. Okay? And so the participles start acting, they're verbs, essentially, or they don't actually act grammatically like verbs, but they are from verbs. They're verbals. Right, they're verbs that act like nouns, but you think of them as verbs. And yet, so they're acting more like conjunctions, right? So when you use a participle, you're obviously relating this new idea to the previous idea, but you're moving on. So like in English, you have to turn that into a bunch of sentences to be clear. So that's not literal, right? If you were translating it literally, you would translate all of those verbs that are in that passage we read as participles. So it would all be bringing, having, right, etc. Which then in English just gets clunky, right? All languages have this, right? No language can be absolutely literally translated into another language. It just won't work, right? I don't know if you've ever heard an aphorism or something from another language, and you hear it translated directly, and you go, that doesn't make sense in English. Right?
Well, and if you're watching a film with subtitles,
right?
They are not.
Sometimes you go, if you know a little bit of the language, right, and you're like, that is not what he just said. So there's this tension in translation, right, between getting it as precise as you can to the meaning, right, to the meaning and the flow of the original language while still making it good English. Actually, you can go beyond that. Like there are some translations. The New American Standard Bible is one of these, I think. It's a translation that goes a little further than still keeping it good English, right? It's really kind of clunky English, but it's much more true to the original flow of the Greek and Hebrew, right? So yeah.
When I was teaching here at Montessori, ages 2 to 7, one of the children used the word ain't all the time.
Yep.
I hope this kind of ties in. I
Go
was
ahead.
challenged. So I would whisper.
Isn't. Yeah.
In her ear, and after about 5 days of me whispering in her ear every time she said ain't, which was frequent, she finally challenged me.
Right. Like, well, why is it that rather than ain't?
She said, it's okay for me to say that at home.
Right.
Because that's what I hear all the time.
Right.
I don't hear what you're trying to tell me to do.
Right.
So why is it?
Right.
I tell you what, was pretty challenged.
That's a hard question to answer, isn't it?
It is very hard. So I just came up with the idea that there was a primary language and a secondary language, and that I was trying to teach her the primary one. Most people say it the way I'm whispering in your ear.
Right.
And
well, and there's a class issue involved, right?
Sort of ish. It's one-on-one in Montessori.
Sure, but whether you use isn't and aren't or ain't.
I didn't want them saying ain't all the time.
Right.
So I had to correct it.
So I got in this. I was when I did missions training. I was doing it with mostly kids out of high school, and I had finished college. And I was an English lit major, and I had taken classes on dialect and linguistics and that sort of stuff. Not a lot, but I had taken some. And so I got into this argument with one of these girls who was homeschooled, and she was one of those homeschooled people. Well, I guess, all homeschooled kids pick up things from their parents. Like their parents teach them something, right? And it's not always completely thought out, right? I mean, part of the reason you homeschool is because you want your kids to learn from you and not from some of these other people who you don't trust, right? So that's one thing. But then no one knows everything, right? So there's that too.
Kids pick that up whether or not they're homeschooled.
Right, well, exactly. Right. So she was homeschooled, and so her father was like the authority, right? I hope my kids are like that too. But yeah, and Lucy says, "Daddy." So her dad had told her that to use like Ebonics, right? So inner city African American dialect. Or like ain't, like a rural American dialect, that those people are dumber, right? Then they're dumber. They don't know how to speak the language, right? And I had to correct her and say, no, actually, they are speaking perfectly grammatically for the dialect they were taught. Right? Everybody learns a dialect, and everybody learns that dialect perfectly when they're a kid, right?
Yes.
There is a social convention that some dialects don't sound as educated, right, or as universal as others. So it's really a social reason that you teach kids that. Right? You teach them isn't and aren't so that they have that choice, right? Depending on who they're talking to, right? And they're not stuck in the dialect that they learned as a kid.
So she's on
Socially.
Facebook with me now.
Yeah.
She has twins, and she's the first college graduate
of her family.
in her family.
Right, right. And that doesn't mean she's holier than anyone else or even smarter than anyone else. But she's got choices and opportunities that other people don't have, right? And so in loving her, you gave her that option, not because to use this other dialect would be dumb, right? That's not true, but because there are options available if you learn this one.
That was very uniquely challenging.
Yeah. Yes?
When you're talking about the run-on sentences, like in Ephesians this morning,
Yeah.
if you're reading it formally,
Yes.
well, how do you know when to breathe?
If you're reading the Greek?
When you're reading the Ephesians this morning.
In English or in Greek?
In English.
In English. Well, the English translators have cut it up into sentences, right? So, and, the translations we use have been vetted by me, as well as others, as much as I can. I'm not, the expert, but, I can get around. So, but they've also been vetted by other people, and they're all committee translations, right? So there are translations, like you can get, what's Peterson's paraphrase? The word?
The Message.
The Message, that's it. Thank you. Eugene Peterson is Presbyterian pastor who I respect, and he did a sort of translation-ish of the New Testament and called it The Message. That's a one-man translation, right? And most people would call it a paraphrase, right? The line between translation and paraphrase is fuzzy, okay? So, but most Koine Greek scholars would probably say, yeah, that's, but that's the task he set himself. That's what he wanted to do, right? He wasn't trying to give a very precise translation. He was trying to give a dynamic. He wanted something that people could read and get hit in the face by the meaning of the scripture, right? That's by the sense of the scripture, right? Like read this and go, oh yeah, now I get it, right? And that's fine. I wouldn't use that for public reading of scripture because he doesn't always capture all of the nuance because he's going for a punch, right? So
is that comparable to the Good News for Modern Man?
Okay, so the good news is a little further towards the translation end. The Good News Bible. The technical name for that is Today's English Version. I think I've got that right. Today's English Version, TEV. And I think that is actually a fascinating translation because for most of the time, I don't think it's not what I would do. Right? Because they are specifically trying to bring all of it down to like an 8th grade level, I think, is what it is. There's another one called the Contemporary English Version, CEV, that tries to bring it all down to a 4th grade level, right? So these all have their places, right? If you're trying to give a Bible to someone who doesn't read that well, give them a CEV or a TEV, right? They still need the Bible, and it's great if they get into reading those, right? I'm nitpicking now, right? So the joke among some of us is the NIV, which is kind of ubiquitous now, right? We used to call it the nearly inspired version. But that's just tongue-in-cheek. Like, it's a perfectly good translation. It's just not as precise. It's more towards that dynamic equivalent side. But the interesting thing about the TEV, the Good News Bible, is that when it comes to really difficult passages to translate, sometimes they really nail it, right? Because a lot of times, if it's really hard to translate, there's no way to be really precise, right? And so they've gotten really good in their, translation process of really trying to encapsulate it in simple, brief language. And a lot of times, they do a really good job with those really difficult passages. Yes, Venus.
No, okay. I always think different.
That's all right. You bring a new perspective. We can talk about it.
I'm all for, I guess this is how I think, and I guess people don't think the way I do. I'm all for the hip-hop generation.
Yeah.
Bible technology. I'm all for, if I want to bring in a generation to Christ,
right.
I want to talk their language.
Right.
See, and I think that's what's missing in a lot of everybody on their high horse. I think you got to come to their level to bring those souls to Christ.
So there are, I 100% agree with you. Okay, so what you're talking about here is enculturation. That's the fancy word for that, right? Translating the gospel, right, into another culture. Right? And culture always includes language, right? And the way people use language. So there is always going to be the need for both of these things, right? On the one hand, we need to enculturate the gospel for everyone, right? Everyone needs to be able to respond to Jesus in terms that they understand, right? On the other hand, if we made it into a complete free-for-all, right? If we just said, well, yeah, translate this into that and go for it, and never had a more sort of precise attempt to capture the meaning of the New Testament, right? Then it would just morph over time and as it went into other cultures, right? So my point is that both of these are always true, right? It's always going to be a tension, right? That we live in the middle of, right? Of, accuracy and fidelity, right? Faithfulness to what God has actually said in Scripture, right? And as accurate as we can get it. And on the other hand, making sure that it really does reach people, right? There is a reason. There's a reason that I, in particular, serve this parish and not some other parish, right? And part of that reason is because this is a culture I think I can do that in, right? Now that doesn't mean I'm never going to use a word that goes over your head. I may, because I'm me and, I can't be anyone else and that's the way I am, and darn it. But that doesn't make me better. It just makes me me, right? So if I do, always feel free to say, Father, not getting it. Come on, right? I'm always open to that because I want to do that work of making it accessible to you so you can have that aha moment, right? Of like, oh, okay, now I get it. That's the teacher in me. So it is.
So what do you think about the Oxford Annotated Bible?
So, I own one. I own one in the RSV, not the NRSV. The NRSV, how shall I put this? The NRSV offends me, shall we say. Mostly in the new Revised Standard Version. All they did was take the Revised Standard Version, which was still perfectly fine, and they hacked it up with inclusive language that didn't make it more understandable to anybody. It just made it worse English, right? Yes.
Everyone 100% has this problem with Shakespeare, like the No Fear Shakespeare stuff they do with Spartacus and stuff.
Yes.
They do not actually make it any more understandable. They just take out all the these and thous and put in you and your.
Right.
Which
doesn't really help that much.
Nobody I've ever met actually has very much of a problem getting used to the and thou instead of you and your.
Over
they have
a few
trouble
minutes, right.
with the cultural transition and the construction of the sentence. If you just take out the and thou and put in you and your, it doesn't help anyone understand it any better.
Right.
They're just
well, it might help a few people understand it better, but not very many.
It does not help, and it's gonna give them those words, but it's not gonna give them all of this other stuff.
Yeah, it's not really gonna give them the sense of it.
Yes.
Right.
But nobody speaks that language anymore, thou and thee.
Yeah, but I don't
like that.
But what I think what Lucy's saying is that most people, if they go to see a play by Shakespeare, for example, or Ben Jonson or whatever, if they go to the play, very very quickly as they listen, they will get into that, even if they're not going to get into it enough that they use it at home, right? They don't have that much trouble just understanding that thee means you. Right?
So writing something today, we're obviously not going to use the and thou, but if we're trying to...
Unless you're me and weird, but yeah.
Or you're writing a novel and you're trying to be archaic.
Right.
But if we're trying to just communicate a concept today, we're going to use you and your instead of the and thou, because that's how we talk, and that's proper English now.
Right.
But if we're trying to understand something that was written several hundred years ago, or in the case of the Bible, more than several hundred years ago, then we're going to have to understand a lot more than the actual words. We're going to have to understand how those words go together and what they mean in the context of this,
of the time.
Right.
Of the time.
And sometimes those really do need to be updated, right? There are words that shift their meaning like 180 degrees sometimes.
Yes.
Right. My favorite example of this is one of the collects of the church here used to say, "Lord, prevent us." But it didn't mean keep us from doing something. It meant go before us, prevent. Right? It's a Latinate word. Right? Veni is go, right? And pre is before. So prevent. Now it just simply doesn't mean that to anyone. And that's something that's hard, right? That would be good to kind of translate for people because they're not going to catch it. Thee and thou, I think people pretty quickly go, oh yeah, okay. If they're willing to, get into it that way.
So you translate them to make something more accessible, but not to make something better understood.
Right. Yeah, you don't do that to make it more precise. Right? If you're making it more precise, then there are words and concepts and things that you're going to have to then turn around and teach to people. Right? Okay, so here's the scripture. This is what that means. Right? And that's always true too. I mean, everything we learn, we learn through a tradition. Right? I mean, the person doing DNA research, right, is doing that within a particular tradition of scientific practice, right? It's inescapable. Everything we know comes to us through some sort of tradition. Yeah.
So why do you think Americans think that their English is so superb? Why do you think that?
I think
other cultures don't think that way.
Yeah, well, I think every culture has that. So you have this in England as well, right? If you listen to announcers on the BBC, right, they're using that standard British, the King's English or the Queen's English right now, right? But that's not the way hardly anybody in England speaks, right? That's an Oxbridge posh kind of accent, right? So if you hear somebody speaking like that, they're kind of upper crust, right?
Aristocrats.
No, not aristocrats necessarily, although the aristocrats would be part of that, but they are, from the people who can afford to, and have been for a while, been able to afford to send their children to Oxford and Cambridge, right? And that sort of thing. So, but as I say, there are hundreds of dialects, right, in the British Isles. Like, I mean, if you include the Gaelic ones, it goes way beyond. But I've done this. Go to a farmyard in Wales, and you won't be able to understand a single word from any person except the owner, because she went to Oxford, right? So I had that experience, right?
That's my point.
Yeah.
The more educated someone is, the more they speak more proper.
More proper, right? But it's and my point to my friend in my missions training was that it's not more proper, right? Is that everybody learns their own dialect absolutely perfectly, right? Unless they are stupid, like if they're mentally, restricted somehow, right? Deficient, then maybe they don't. But everyone with a working brain learns their dialect. All of us learn to speak.
But society does not look the way.
Yes.
You know where I'm going with this.
I do. So why, think about it for a second, why, whenever we want to sound dumb, right, if we're joking around, and we put words in the mouth of some character that's just a dumb person. Why do we always sound like this?
Because the Yankees think we're all stupid.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. It's the rural Southerners, right, were considered stupiderly, right? So that's a joke for Lucy. That's an in-joke. But and so socially, it has nothing to do with linguistics, right? But socially, some dialects are considered socially superior to others. Always, in every language, okay? In every language, every society. That's just a fact of life, is that some dialects are going to socially be superior, right? The rich people talk different than the poor people.
Differently.
And I did that on purpose, right? They talk different, Kay.
Pity Mary isn't here right now.
Yeah. Mary would just be climbing the walls right now with me doing this. I have a joke with Mary whenever she goes off to a dance competition. I say, dance the bestest.
And she has a minor breakdown.
And she goes, no! And that's our little routine. So this is always the case. I mean, if you, it's also true that these things change over time, right? So this is one of my favorite examples. How do you pronounce the word S-C-O-N-E? Scone or scone or scone? It depends, right?
Depends on where you live. It's scone in England and scone.
Well, it depends on where you live, when you live, and what class you belong to. Okay? And it shifts over time, right? So, and what happens is the young people of the upper classes will pick up pronunciations and terms from the lower classes just to give their parents a hard time. Right? So, I mean, it seems silly to us, scone, whatever, right? But at a certain time in England, right, if your kid said, "Good morning, Mother, may I have a scone?" Right? That would have been a no. Right? Just the way, today, someone, some kid might, I'm probably behind the times I was at, but, some young person might say, "Mom, you're the bomb," right? I mean, where'd they get that? Well, they got that from a different, right, culture that socially is beneath them, right? That doesn't mean anyone's dumber or, anything. It just means socially it's considered below. And they're doing it may be kind of tongue-in-cheek and friendly, or it might be, "Hey, Mom, look at me, I'm wearing my pants below my butt," right? Whatever, right? I mean, so... Anyway.
They know which mom to talk to.
I'll send them to you, I know. Your boys never did that.
They knew better.
They knew better, that's right. So anyway, it all depends on class and context and all these things. So.
Well, back to when Lucy brought up Shakespeare.
Yes.
And this is maybe a little veering off of what we're talking about, but if you go in and say you and your in Elizabethan language, you're breaking into the mental picture that you're in with this story of whatever Shakespeare play you're talking about. It's like a boing, and it's when they want to do Shakespeare and put on today's clothes and speak in today's language, you lose so much of the whole beauty and why Shakespeare is eternal. It's like you were talking about the Iliad, and you cannot read it in English and get the beauty of it. You've got to read it in Greek.
Right.
So there's more to this.
By the way, I haven't done that. because I'm not good enough at Greek to do that. But yeah.
Well, there's just more to
but that's always true.
Communicating than
right.
just the words you're saying.
I often don't. I mean, I know this is something where I'm more populist than I sometimes am, but I don't like to watch films with subtitles.
Oh, I don't either.
Because I'm not really getting it.
Yeah.
Right? It's, you know, and sometimes I do. So there are some movies that you go, okay, or you really need to see this because it's an important cultural thing or something, right? So you do that. For the same reason, I don't particularly like to read translations of novels. Right? The Russian novels that everybody goes on and on about, I'm like, okay. I mean, there are some that I've read, and, you know, there are some I will read, but I don't get excited about that process because I know I'm not really hearing the novel.
Yeah.
Just
right?
getting the gist of it.
Yeah, that's
not
right.
really.
That's right. That's right. And sometimes that's enough. Like with something like the Brothers Karamazov, that's good enough.
It's enough
right?
to have a conversation.
It's enough. That's right. It's enough to be getting some of Dostoevsky's thought, and right, you may as well get it that way than not, right? But in a lot of cases, it's like it just doesn't translate that well, right?
Yeah, half of novelism is plot, characters, themes, point, and half of it is language.
Language, right.
And you
says our budding novelist.
You only get half of that if you have to read it in another language.
Right.
And so you still get really great stuff if you're reading something
right. in
translated,
translation. Right.
but you're not getting the full impact of the original work. And
right.
we can't memorize all hundreds of languages there are.
That's right. So even with like Middle English, that's really hard, and you know. But some of it you can get. I mean, we've been doing poetry this year, and I insisted that we read some of the Middle English stuff in Middle English, right? And we did, and we kind of plowed through it, and we didn't go very far with that, but it's different, right? It's not
There's still
the same
a
in
sense
translation.
you can get from it,
right?
and you can understand enough of the words that you can feel like you actually read something, and that you can almost communicate with someone from that era.
Right.
You can't talk it back to them.
Right.
But you get this sense of their artistry that you don't get.
That you don't get if you read a translation.
Well, let me ask about Greek.
Sure, back to New Testament Greek.
Well, the fact that since Greek didn't have punctuation, how do you theorize, or do you know, how did they communicate what they were saying? Since you were talking about where do you breathe when you said, someone said,
where do you breathe? Yeah, you're just asking when you're reading it,
so
where do you breathe?
how did they know? What told them it's time to breathe or pause or?
So that's a good question. It has to do with the nature of language and grammar, right? There are some times that if there were no punctuation, like just think of English, right, which you know, there are some cases in which punctuation really matters, right? There's that whole book, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, right? And, you know, the panda walks into a bar and I forget the middle part of it, but then, you know, the punchline is he eats, shoots, and leaves. You got it, right. So, of course, pandas eat shoots and leaves, right?
He doesn't eat,
but
shoot.
Right, but if you put commas in there, that's a different sentence,
that's
right? So there are things that matter like that. But generally speaking, you can figure it out, right? You can, even if there were no punctuation at all, if I just gave you a page of the newspaper, extracting all of the punctuation, you could still pretty much make your way through it. It would just be more laborious.
But that's
right? It would be harder.
That happens to me now, Father, even in books that are
right. I do.
They're doing
too.
away with commas. And I read a lot more twice because I didn't get it the first time.
Because I didn't know where the comma was supposed to go because you didn't boil it in there. Right,
exactly right.
Yeah, I'm a notorious overuser of commas.
Oh,
my kids will tell you.
That's hereditary, by the way.
Me too. I mean, it is not necessary to the meaning of the sentence. You take those commas and put them in.
Right. Right.
Because there have been examples of, if there's not a period at the end of the sentence could end into the second one, and that second one still makes sense as something separate.
Yeah.
So it
Yes.
had to have been sort of tough
Yeah.
to figure out where the thought ended, actually.
Sometimes, yes. So there are passages where that makes a difference.
Yeah.
And those will come up in commentaries if you really start studying, right? And leaning on people who really know the Greek, right, or the Hebrew, then those sorts of things will come up. But not as often as you might think. I think.
Is modern Greek, can modern Greek people read the early Greek New Testament and get it, or is it changed?
Yeah, maybe. It's like, it would be like
English?
us. I'm not sure exactly how far, right? Different languages change at different rates, and right? So someone who speaks Icelandic can actually read all the Icelandic literature all the way back to the Middle Ages, right? It just hasn't changed that much, right? There probably are some archaisms. It would be like us reading Shakespeare. Right, but you can do it.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas English, we can only barely understand back to about Shakespeare. Right. Maybe a little before that. Right, but then it gets harder and harder. By the time you get back to 1400, it's gone. Right. If you really squint, as you're listening, you can kind of catch a few words, but that's probably about it. Even with Shakespeare, there is a whole group of people who insist that the way we speak Shakespeare nowadays is wrong. And they have this whole theory, and they're probably right, I think. They've worked out this whole pronunciation as it would have been. And sometimes, they make this point, and it's true, sometimes the jokes don't work unless you do it that way. Right?
That makes sense.
And various other things, right? Just a silly example, one of Shakespeare's sonnets, the last couplet, right, which is supposed to rhyme. If this be so, if this be true, and upon me proved, then something, and no man ever loved.
I think it's I never writ.
Yes, then I never writ, and no man ever loved. Proved and loved rhyme.
Really?
Yes. This comes up in hymns sometimes. Right? If they're older.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Those lines rhyme. We just don't pronounce it right anymore. Right?
I do just to be silly.
Right. No, and I do too. I kind of reflexively do it because it's supposed to rhyme, right?
Yeah, right.
So it's actually it's love. It's proved and loved.
Yeah.
Right? Proved and loved. Those rhyme. That's the way he would have pronounced them. So he rhymes them. Yes?
When you're talking about improving languages, what do you think about the change of the book of Psalms into Psalms Now?
That book, Psalms Now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't used that book very much. I know of it and have seen it. And I know some of you love it, and that's fine. It's not the Psalms.
It's easier to
right?
read, but yeah.
Yeah, so, there's no problem, zero problem using that, right? They're still prayers, and they kind of take the matter of the Psalms and kind of spin it out into something that, is a little easier for us to read, maybe. And that's awesome.
But it's not even trying to be a translation.
But it's not even trying to be a translation. That's right. It's even more like the message than the message is, right?
Right.
So I would say there's absolutely nothing wrong with those things. You just have to remember what it is you're dealing with, right? I'm not going to try and take that into church and chant it with y'all, right? Because it's not the Psalms, right? It's just that's not what it's for.
Not the Bible songs.
Right, that's just not what it's for, and that's fine. And, I have no problem with the message, or, I mean, for my own purposes, I'm like an egghead, and I like those translations. I actually even like the New American Standard, where it's a little clunky, but it's really consistent in its translation, right? It works hard at translating those Greek words the same way every time, unless you really can't, right? Unless the semantic range is just too far apart between the Greek and the English, right? I like that, right? I don't even like the NIV for myself, right? Because it translates out some of those figures of speech that I want to hear, right? When I read the Bible. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it, right? I'm happy reading the NIV if I'm in a Bible study or something and somebody says, here, that's fine.
It's still the Bible.
It's still the Bible. It's just, you have to, because, I touched on this a few minutes ago, but because all knowledge is fideistic, right? It requires faith to know anything, right? Because of that, you also kind of need to know where your gaps are, if you can, right? There are going to be some things that you just never get until somebody smacks you with them, right? Like, oh, I never thought of that. But as much as possible, you need to know what you are dealing with, and because of that, you also need to know what you're not dealing with, right? So we need to remember, if we're reading any translation, that's what it is, right? There are sometimes more kind of piety movement Christians, right, who like to take we all have heard the joke, like, I like my Bible in the King James, just like Jesus, right? Obviously that's a joke, and no one actually believes that, probably. But some people get close, right? I just ran into someone at the hospital a few weeks back who I was reading a book that had, Christianity in the title, and so I was just sitting there reading, waiting for Jenny to be done with her procedure, and this guy sort of accosted me. He said, "So are you?" And he didn't really want to talk about what I was reading. He wanted to tell me about what he believed. One of those guys. And he insisted that the King James was the only right English translation, right? And I'm like, well, I read the Greek. He's like, oh, okay. So there are those, but my point is, people will often take the English translation and build their theological speculations on the minutest of points in the English kind of syntax or the word choices or whatever, right?
You can't analyze a language that isn't the original. You have to go back to the Greek if
you
want to be nitpicky.
If you want to be that kind of, close in your reading, then you got to go back to the Greek, right? Now, what I will also say is most of us shouldn't try to be that finicky, right? We should just read the Bible in translation, right? Yeah. And because most of the time, it just means what it says. Right?
What was that you said, the New American what?
The New American Standard, NASB.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right, I just want to make sure I have that one, it's in here,
yeah.
okay.
I kind of like that one, even though it's a little, if you read it like out loud, it's a little clunky. But
the way I live my life,
mm-hmm.
I use the KISS effect. You know what that is?
Yeah, keep it simple, stupid.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what I do. And,
mm-hmm.
and
that's good advice. Yeah.
And I can breathe when I read the Bible.
Right.
I just keep it simple.
Right.
I mean,
and that's what I'm arguing for too.
I mean,
right.
life is too short to go through all these,
Right.
Keep it simple.
I mean, and that's completely a part of our tradition, right? What's his name? The early English translator who was burned at the stake by Henry VIII.
Henry VIII burned a lot of people.
Yeah, but the Bible translator whose name is escaping me right now. It'll come to me. Anyway, his statement was, I want to translate the Bible so that even the plowman in the field can read it for himself. Right?
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. I can't remember the name. So, and yeah, absolutely. But that should be part of what we want. At the same time, it is also important to have teaching authorities, right, who can read it more closely and say, whoa, time out, right? That's something in the English that isn't there in the Greek, or so, right? Something like that. So, but that's not most of the time. Most of the time, it's KISS. Just read it.
And that's not everyone's calling. There are people who are
exactly.
called to be the people
right.
who go.
I'm one of those weird people who's called to be someone who could do that for you, right? Up to a point. I've not been called to go, immerse myself in Greek so that I can be part of a translating committee officially, right? That's not part of my calling. But it is part of my calling to understand it enough that I can kind of tease out some of that stuff and understand those guys when they talk about it, right? Because when they talk about it, you wouldn't even understand. Unless they work really hard. So anyway, that was one. I do want to answer your question from way back about the Oxford Annotated. The translation of the RSV is a good translation. I like that translation. It's the next thing in the line of the King James Version, right? The King James Version is an amazingly good translation in balancing that, making it really beautiful English and good English and yet really capturing the original meaning, right? They're very good at that. But it's a little archaic for a lot of people, and some of the texts they were translating from were not the best. And so it was definitely worthwhile updating it by 1950 or whenever they did that. And that's a good translation. Like I said, the NRSV is not to my taste. The problem with the Oxford Annotated is that not always, but sometimes the notes are clearly coming from a skeptical standpoint. Right? So the people who, wrote the notes and everything aren't necessarily coming at it from within the faith in an authentic way, right?
Back when there was the Anglican School of Theology here,
yes,
I took some classes there,
mm-hmm.
and that was the Bible they wanted you to use, and I just...
And that was me in seminary too.
Wondered what made that one.
It was just sort of it's Oxford. Obviously, it's the best, right?
I'm not dealing with any more of this in my life. Any more of this.
I'm not speaking for myself. I'm channeling someone else here.
I know you are. You do that all the time.
So I deal in satire a lot, but that's what she's responding to. So seriously though, it's the old. If you have a British accent, that adds automatically at least 10 IQ points to your perceived intelligence, right?
Even if it's completely false.
Even if that's completely false, even if it's not the posh Oxbridge accent, right? I mean, I knew a priest who was completely Cockney, right? He had a full-on Cockney accent. He talked like this, you know. But he was a priest. He took a parish in the U.S. and the same effect worked. Like, it was British, and so it was, you know, clearly he knows what he's talking about, right? And he was a good guy. I didn't, you know, have a problem with him, but still. So there's that. Also, Oxford really does have a tradition of the finest biblical scholars going way back, right? Back to some of our heroes, right? I mean, E.B. Pusey was a biblical scholar at Oxford. So, and he was one of the founders of the Anglo-Catholic, Tractarian movement. So they do. It does sort of represent the mostly the pinnacle of scholarly engagement with the text. What I have found, because I used that as my basic, Bible to go from for years in preaching and all of that. What I found along the way was the notes just aren't that helpful. Most of the notes just kind of give you an outline, right? So it'll be like, chapter 5, verse 14 to chapter 7, verse 27 seems to be one, continuous section, right? And you're like, well,
you get that.
Thanks. That really wasn't that helpful, right? So, and then they'll say a little more about it, but most of the time I read the notes and went, yeah, I knew that already, right?
I'm glad you noticed. I would be concerned about my translators if I didn't.
Right, if you didn't notice that, right? But that doesn't really help me, So, so that's what I think about the Oxford Annotated.
But it's pretty translated pretty.
The translation, there's no problem with. Yeah, no. As far as I'm concerned, there are some people who would take, who would nitpick on some of them. Yeah. Like that's true of any translation.
Yeah.
So, but no, it's still the translation that we read from publicly in church. So, the NRSV, like I said, it just hacked it up for inclusive language, and so they don't say brothers, they say, brothers and sisters. They don't say men, they use people, right? And it just gets old. Like, it's not wrong, right? It's not a wrong translation. It's just because the Greek word adelphoi means brothers, but it also means sisters too, if there are any included, right? And you just get that from context. So it's not wrong, it's just, we can know that without you plugging it in, right? I mean, come on.
Sort of like S-U-N and S-O-N used in like the hymnal especially.
Yeah.
It bothers me.
You know what? My mom actually once, this was with one of the praise choruses in the renewal movement, but it said S-O-N, or no, it said S-U-N. You'll know this one. As I fall on my knees with my face to the rising sun, and it's S-U-N, right? And my mom kind of wrote a note to the rector once. She's laughing because she knows Granny Ann. And she doesn't do that a lot, but every once in a while she will respectfully. And she goes to a really large parish, so, when you bring something up to the rector, it's more of a thing, But, and the next week they did the same song, but they had changed, and they even did the slides up, and they had changed it to S-O-N.
That's what happens when you don't bring things up that much, is when you do, they
they go, oh, yeah. So, I actually disagree with her on that problem. right? That particular problem. Because we do have biblical imagery of Jesus coming back from the rising of the sun. S-U-N, right? Clearly it's imagery, like my face is to the rising sun, and therefore also toward the sun, S-O-N, right? So I never had a problem with that. I actually never had a problem with it until she brought it up, and then as a kid I was like, oh yeah. And then I worked through it the way I just explained. But, but that bothered her. And so, yeah. All right, have we way overgone our time? I think we have. So, one question, which was, when you say the Lord be with you, and the response is, and with your spirit, why do we say, and with your spirit, instead of with his, and with his spirit? Because it's me you're talking to and not God. That's why. That was the answer to that question.